Let's go back to our story in Kenya, where the Chief Justice, the first woman to occupy that position, is very concerned about the menace which is corruption in society, but is also existing within the judiciary. And she's also concerned about the relationship between the judiciary and the executive, which has soured quite a bit in the last few years. Well, to help us unpack these issues, we're now joined by Margaret Monyani, who's a lecturer at the international relations at Wits University. Margaret, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
All right, so corruption in the judiciary sounds shocking, but I suppose it's something that Kenyans don't find surprising.
Yes, indeed, as you say, we are not surprised. Actually, the judiciary, historically, the judiciary in Kenya has always had this political grip, like there is no independence. Because, you know, one of the major characteristics of a democracy is an impartial and independent judiciary. So once that is interfered with, then the work of the judiciary is compromised. And for a very long time, I can actually say since independence, it's just up to when Kibaki was elected in 2002 is when we started seeing serious strides towards the judicial reforms. But then if you look back, you'll only find that about in 1952, there was some Prevention of Corruption Act that was adopted. Then years later, up to 1992, the same act is trying to be, it was now discarded, and then they adopted the Anti-Corruption Squad. That is, we are talking about over 30 years or 40 years later. So we see a few strides later in 1997, and then 2003, the gear picks up, and then it culminates in the introduction, in the adoption of the 2010 new constitution. That's the new constitution is the only document that then made the judiciary to be at par with the legislature and the executive. But that wasn't the case before then, because from its Article 160, it clearly stipulates that the judiciary shall only perform as per the constitution. It should not take orders from elsewhere. So that is the only time that the judiciary gets at par with the rest of the two arms of government. But to say that corruption has surprised Kenyans, no, that has always been the case.
So the judiciary at par now with the executive, that may be the case in law, but is it the case in practice?
Now, yes, you raise a very important thing. So in law, on paper, it says so, that there will be no interference from the legislature. There'll be no interference from the executive, because this is what used to happen. Initially, actually, corruption in Kenya, when you read about it, it was only propagated by people in the executive and the legislature. The golden bag scandals, the mega scandals were about people who, in the government, the legislature and the executive, who had misappropriated funds. So later on is when people learned how it plays out with the judiciary, when these perpetrators of these scandals they never faced the law. As a matter of fact, in 1993, one of the mega corruption scandals in the Kenyan history, the golden bag, that involved billions of US dollars, the Attorney General himself, instead of fighting because this is taxpayers' money, instead of fighting so that this money can be returned to the government, he actually used his power. There is a clause in the constitution then to actually discontinue charges against two high-ranking officials in government. So you can see that. Then from there, people started looking keenly at the judiciary, thinking that it's gone too far. The corruption has gone too far. So it's something, I agree, and it is at various levels. Because when we talk about the judiciary, it's also something we need to understand, that the judiciary doesn't just constitute the lawyers, the magistrates, and the judges. That is always the misconception. But the judiciary is an entire system. It starts right from where when you have an issue and you have to report to the police, how is that case reported? Are the right details taken? Through the investigation, how was the investigation conducted? You have seen, or you have heard of cases where they say the evidence was tampered with. or there was not enough evidence, just because the evidence collection process was corrupted. So it's a whole system. It includes the lawyers, magistrates, police, the prison officers as well, because sometimes the judiciary does a good job. They put some people behind the bars, but when they get to prison, they get some preferential treatment or something like that. So it's a whole system that needs to be revamped.
So what you're saying is, in practice, what's happening is if you've got money, chances are the law will fall on your side. And if you've got political power, again, the law will work on your side.
Exactly. Because actually, what is corruption? Corruption is actually using your authority for personal gain. But normally our layman understanding of corruption usually implies giving bribes. And I want us to understand that it's beyond that. It's actually even using influence, so that maybe if you are in court, you get a lesser sentence, you get a lesser fine, or sometimes threatening. Violence sometimes is used against the judges, so that if they're not bowing to the pressure of the political elite, you have had cases sometimes people saying, okay, my security was withdrawn, or by the time I got at the gate of my house, I saw someone with a hoodie, that kind of, so intimidation, the influence, and actually political corruption, the influence part of it is the easiest and the common type of corruption. But, the layman always thinks about giving a bribe. But it goes, and it even includes sexual favors. It's a whole multi-dimensional concept. So it's not something that just starts and stops with money. There is also corruption that happens in kind.
How endemic is it? I mean, are we seeing this in the lowest courts in the furthest part of the country, right through to the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court?
Actually, everywhere.
Wow.
Almost, not almost, because if you look at the reports that if I go back up to 2010, even as we had adopted a new constitution, and then there was a survey by Transparency International, and they realized that up to the 60 or 70% of Kenyans that were involved in that survey agreed, said that they had been asked to pay a bribe in one way or the other. So it is very rampant. It starts from where you report at the police station. Actually, that it's common in Kenya that you will call the police. Maybe your house has been broken into, and you say, okay, I have an emergency, and you will hear the police tell you, send us some money because we don't have gas. We don't have gas to get to your house. So you see, even the money, so it means when the police don't have money, what happens? Then the human rights are interfered with. So what I would say to your question is, yes, it starts from the lowest to the highest. It's only that what happens actually is that the highest are the ones who get in the news. But on a day-to-day basis, someone has even used humor in this sense and said, even you as a parent, when your child is crying and you give them a sweet, that is some kind of form of corruption that we don't see, because you're giving them a sweet so that they can keep quiet.
And then there's this difficult relationship between the executive and the judiciary. Has it only gotten worse in recent years, or has the tension always been there and it's just become a bit more vocal and public since the Building Bridges initiative saga?
So, like I said in the first question, is that what happened is that the legislature and the executive have always had a grip on the judiciary. It was like this, they were the big brothers, and they would twist this younger brother who was the judiciary. But then come the constitution and a few reforms in the last decade, then you see the judiciary is becoming more independent and even turning over the presidential election. So I think now the judiciary is not feeling, the legislature, the executive are not happy with this new kind of paradigm shift. And they want to go back to the status quo because it favored them. It allowed massive corruption. And because many of those people that attained wealth through corruption, they can only sustain it through corruption. So when they see these reforms, they know they'll be targeted. So it's one of those where one arm of government wants to have control over the other, and actually they want just to subdue the judiciary.
Can the relationship be fixed, or is it one that perhaps a healthy antagonism might be the best thing for society?
Yeah, actually, it's a good thing actually to see these things play out. And if you are keen and you are following this, and you because the fact that the judiciary has done some very historical, like the turning of the elections, the BBI initiative, the turning of the BBI bill, and all that. So in a way, it also gives hope to the citizens. And then, of course, this new antagonism comes in. It's the society is made up of different parts. There's gonna always be conflict, and when power is involved, it gets worse because it's about who gets what, when, and how. So, but we must make sure that even as this antagonism exists, it should ultimately unfold to a level where now Kenyans, the judiciary, gets to a point where it is sensitive to people's needs and not sensitive to the what Kenyans call tumbocrats, simply the politicians.
Margaret, that's where we'll leave it. Always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for filling us in on matters judicial and this relationship, which has become quite prickly between the executive and the judiciary. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Asante sana.